For many years, I focused my photography almost exclusively on landscapes and nature. I didn't make any money from it, but it remained a wonderful hobby. Being outdoors in nature, in places and at times when hardly anyone else is around, and capturing the wonders of the natural world in a photo, that has always been something special for me. Back then, I even turned down portrait shoots, at least as hobby, because I simply wasn't that interested in capturing people. When I started wedding photography a few years ago, it was initially mostly for financial reasons, honestly. It's just easier to make money in that field compared to landscape photography. Not to say it's impossible, there are plenty of great examples out there, but it's definitely more challenging. There was even a time when I couldn't imagine becoming a wedding photographer at all, but that has changed drastically over time, and the more weddings I got to photograph, the more fascinating this area of photography became to me. When you're photographing weddings, you are not just capturing people, you are documenting an event that ideally only happens once in a person's life. Okay, maybe not once, but at least not too often that should happen in a lifetime. Well, you know what I mean. And these photos I take, they have a great chance of actually being seen in many decades and centuries to come by their descendants. What exactly do I mean by that, and why my perspective on photographing people changed so drastically over time, and what event made me realize how important people photography really is? You will find that one out after the intro. Enjoy the video. In order to share my thoughts and views on this subject, we first need to take a look at the past. Since the beginning of photography in the mid-1800s, there were people interested in nature, capturing it through photography. Among these pioneers of landscape photography was someone called Hermann Krone, who began exploring landscape and nature photography right after the invention of photography itself. Surely, at the start of photography, I could imagine landscapes being more easier subjects to photograph than, for example, people. You're probably familiar with those images of early photographers with their massive large format cameras. It's easy to imagine how much more difficult it must have been to produce a focused and decent image back then. Another major challenge back then was the long exposure times needed. People had to stand absolutely still for long times to get a sharp image of themselves. That's probably why the first photography of a human being was somewhat of a coincidence. In this image, a man can be seen polishing his shoes. The reason he's visible while all the other people on the street passing by aren't is simply because he stayed still long enough during the exposure to get burned into the image, while the others just blurred away. Back then, photography was vastly different from what it is today. Important personalities were the preferred subject to be immortalized in images. Photography was not only laborious but also expensive, meaning most people couldn't afford to have their likeness captured. However, for the first time in human history, famous individuals had the chance to be preserved in an authentic way for eternity, somewhat that had only been possible through painting and sculptures before. So let's summarize. Landscape photography and portrait photography were likely among the very first genres in the history of photography itself. And back then, when people had only ever seen the world through painted images, nature photography was probably seen as a true technological marvel. Seeing things exactly the way they are in real life was simply impossible before that. Over the decades, there have been many incredible landscape photographers. Another example would be Ansel Adams, whose work was so influential that one of his paintings... Paintings? He wasn't a painter. Or was he? I don't know. Whose work was so influential that one of his photographies made it onto the Voyager Golden Record, a rocket attached to the NASA Voyager spacecraft sent to leave the solar system and fly through the depths of space for eternity, so long it is not being recovered by anybody else at least. All of this sounds wonderful and fascinating, and it really is. I absolutely love landscape and nature photography. So why did I say that photos of people are more significant? And the answer to that question is fairly simple. Not everyone can become a world-renowned nature photographer. What I mean by that is, as beautiful as nature is and as much as I enjoy capturing it, those photos will likely hold little significance in the distant future. And no one may care about them in a few decades. That might sound sad, but in reality it's not a big deal actually, because it doesn't matter and it doesn't diminish my personal joy of landscape photography at all. It is a different story, however, when it comes to photos of people and humans. I'm sure I'm not the only one who finds it absolutely fascinating to browse through old photographies, especially when they feature people you either know personally or you have a direct connection to, like for example family photos. I had something of a wow moment a while ago. My girlfriend and I had just returned from a vacation and wanted to create a photo album with our memories from that trip. On the first page of this album, we decided to insert a map of the country we traveled to and mark the route we had traveled there. Nothing too special, right? A few weeks later, however, I was looking through some old photo albums from my grandparents. I came across an album from a trip they took in the 1950s. I opened up the album and what did I see on the first page? I saw a map of the country they traveled to, in this case Italy, and the route they had traveled. At first glance, it might seem trivial, but the thought behind it fascinated me. Over 60 years apart, yet we had the same idea when creating this album. In the photos of that album are two young people, around the same age as I am now, and it shows what I think sometimes can be forgotten. People from the past were the same human beings as we are today, just in a different time. This album, along with many others from that time or even older, are fascinating relics and fantastic ways to dive into your own history, your personal history. I think nearly everybody has such old photo albums in some way or another. And I mean, everyone is familiar with those old photos from the history books featuring famous personalities, politicians and so on and so on. But you don't really have a personal connection to those images. This is different with personal photos. For example, let's take a look at this picture. Not only did I know the people in this photo, but I also have a personal relationship with the place where it was taken. This is actually my hometown and it's truly fascinating to see it like this in another time frame. As I mentioned in the video about analog photography, it's like a little time travel looking at these old photos. And this brings us to the core message of this video. All of these photos share one thing in common, the human component in it. Sure, there are landscape photographies in these old photo albums too, but I find the images showing the people, those I once knew or were related to me, going about their everyday lives during a time when I didn't even exist, incredibly exciting. And this feeling of nostalgia is something I want my descendants to experience themselves in many decades to come. That's only possible if we capture people today in their current moments, doing what they are doing, even if the true significance won't be understood until years later. The people in these photos from 70 years ago or more probably didn't realize that these images would still be viewed in the distant future, and I believe neither did the photographer knew at that moment as well. Of course, I'm aware that not everyone finds this interesting. For many people it simply doesn't matter and you certainly can't blame them for that. But I also think there are many people like me and will continue to be in the future who share this fascination and will be glad that these relics from a past era exist. Still, another thought quickly comes to mind. Photography has changed so much over the last 70 years. Photos used to be something special, but now anyone can take thousands of pictures of themselves a day. It seems like there is almost no real need for even more personal images of people. And at first glance, that might seem plausible. And of course, no one knows what the future holds, but I believe that most of these everyday photos are kind of temporary actually. I doubt anyone in the distant future will take the time to shift through an ancient iPhone library with 50,000 images. Instead, important moments and events, like weddings for example, will be remembered through photos and nowadays videos as well, of course. And that's why I think most quote-unquote everyday portraits will eventually fade away and get lost. And that's also why I believe it will always make sense to capture quote-unquote real photos and preserve them not only digitally but also physically. This will give future generations a window to the past, a past that was once our present, just like these pictures of the old photo albums I showed you, which was their present at this moment and is now seemingly so far away in the distant past. Of course, no one can predict exactly what the future holds, but just like 70 years ago, when no one could foresee today, photos were still taken. I cannot imagine we will ever be able to truly relive past events when we have no images or videos or any other proof of it. So it's better to capture those moments which seem important to us now and as they happen. Okay, well, this video today almost got a little philosophically. I mean, overall, I'm just some random guy on the internet sharing my thoughts, but I hope you enjoyed the video. And anyway, this brings us almost to the end of this video again. If you enjoyed watching it, feel free to check out my YouTube channel for more photography related content. But for now, I wish you a great day, great week, and goodbye.